The wind screamed outside the cabin, mixing with the panicked screams of the 6 people inside. Everything ended before anyone could even understand what was happening. Just minutes before, veteran pilot Jeff Weiss was confidently flying his familiar Beechcraft Baron 58. No one could have predicted that both engines would suddenly quit mid-flight. How could a pilot with over 5,600 hours of experience end up in such a disaster? The investigation later revealed a more terrifying truth. The crash wasn't caused by a single surprise event, but was the result of a chain of accumulated mistakes. This is a stark warning about complacency, something that can bring down even the most experienced people.
Airspeed 80 knots in falling!
The most frightening part is that these mistakes aren't just in the past. They could happen again at any moment, making us ask, has the aviation industry truly learned its lesson from this tragedy? On the morning of April 22, 2019, a twin-engine Beechcraft Baron 58 lifted off from West Houston Airport. There were 6 people on board, and their destination in Kerrville, Texas, was only about an hour away. The weather looked calm, and everything seemed like a short and safe trip. But only a few miles from the runway, the plane suddenly shook, lost control, and crashed into a ranch. When the smoke cleared, all that remained was wreckage and silence. What made the story even harder to believe was that the man flying that morning was not a beginner. It was Jeff Weiss, a pilot with more than 5,600 hours of experience who knew the Baron 58 better than most. He had flown it often for business, for charity, and for his own personal travel. His passengers were also not strangers. They were well-known figures in Houston's world of art, real estate, and design, and all of them trusted that this would be an easy flight with such an experienced pilot in command. Yet witnesses on the ground saw something terrifying. They watched the Baron dive at a steep angle, rolling to the right as if the pilot had no control at all. Within seconds, the airplane disappeared behind a ridge, followed by a heavy crash that echoed through the hills. By the time investigators reached the scene, no one was alive. The shock came not only from the crash itself, but also from where it happened. The Baron went down just 6 miles from the runway, close enough that the passengers might already have been preparing to land. That detail raised the haunting question: how could a skilled pilot, flying a familiar route, fail so completely just moments from safety? The answer was not a random mechanical failure. The official investigation later uncovered disturbing facts showing that the seeds of this disaster had been planted long before the final minutes of the flight. Jeff Weiss was more than just a pilot. He was a man who balanced a successful career in finance with a deep passion for the sky. During the day, he worked as a senior advisor in wealth management, helping clients plan their futures, but once he left the office, he found true freedom in the cockpit of his airplane. Flying was not a hobby for him, it was part of his identity. Friends and colleagues remembered him for his constant phrase, "Safety first." He volunteered with Angel Flight, carrying patients to medical treatment, and he often helped veterans travel without cost. In the eyes of his community, he was generous, dependable, and fully devoted. Yet behind this careful image was a contrast that few people saw. Flight instructors who worked with him said his hands-on flying skills were strong, but his grasp of complex theory was weaker. When sudden problems appeared in the air, he often struggled to respond quickly, and this weakness would later prove critical. Joining him on the final flight were several well-known figures from Houston. They included real estate investors, an architecture executive, and even a man connected to the Houston Ballet through his marriage to its artistic director. Together, they represented not only business success, but also important parts of the city's cultural life. Their trip to Kerrville was supposed to be routine, a simple chance to check property and talk about renovations, not the last journey of their lives. For the families and communities left behind, the loss was far greater than the numbers written in a report. The Kensinger family was remembered for their dedication to their neighborhood and their children's school. Mark Telepsen came from a family whose name was tied to construction across Texas. And Mark Ciano, a creative landscape architect, shaped public spaces while also being the husband of the artistic director of Houston Ballet. Their sudden absence left projects unfinished, friendships broken, and grief spreading across circles of art, architecture, and real estate. Placed in this context, the tragedy was more than an aviation accident. It was also the collapse of trust in a man who had been admired by those around him. Jeff Weiss was respected, the passengers were accomplished, the airplane was familiar, and the morning was calm, yet the outcome was disaster. That is why investigators and the public were left with a haunting question. If a veteran pilot with an impressive record and a group of influential passengers could not finish a one-hour flight, what hidden danger was strong enough to bring them all down? The answer begins with the airplane itself and the complicated fuel system that was supposed to keep it in the air. The Beechcraft Baron 58 had a reputation as one of the most trusted light twin-engine aircraft in America. With space for 6 people and a maximum fuel capacity of 200 gallons, it was designed for business travel and private flights that demanded both speed and comfort. Pilots admired it for power and reliability, and many believed that the presence of 2 engines gave an extra layer of safety. For Jeff Weiss, who had owned this Baron for almost 2 decades, it was more than a machine. It was a symbol of confidence in the air. Yet the airplane's fuel system was far from simple, and this hidden complexity became a silent trap. Unlike many smaller planes, the Baron used a series of main tanks, auxiliary tanks, pumps, and selectors that required careful management. A pilot had to pay attention to not only how much fuel was on board, but also which tank was feeding which engine at any given time. Any error in calculation or monitoring could lead to fuel starvation on one side, even if fuel was still available in another tank. The design of the gauges made the situation even harder. When the tanks were full, the cockpit indicators often stayed at the top until more than 70 gallons had been used. This meant that during the first stage of a flight, the pilot saw almost no movement, creating a false sense of security. At lower levels, the gauges became more reliable, but by then the margin for error was smaller. In Jeff's airplane, the system carried an extra problem. The transmitters that sent signals to the gauges had electrical resistance issues, which caused them to overread by about 5 gallons on each side. This may sound small, but in aviation 5 gallons can mean the difference between reaching a runway or falling short. The airplane also had a digital engine monitor called an EDM 760, which could calculate fuel burn accurately, but it depended on the pilot entering the right numbers after each refueling. If that step was skipped or entered wrong, the monitor would give a total that looked precise but was completely misleading. For years, Jeff had relied on this mix of gauges, logs, and the EDM, but together they formed a system that required perfection every time. One mistake, even a small one, could build into a hidden gap between what the pilot believed and what was really in the tanks. That gap would later close in the most devastating way. So how did Jeff's routine with this aircraft turn from trust into tragedy? The answer begins with the choices he made in the days leading up to the flight. Every accident leaves a trail of decisions behind it, and in Jeff Weiss's case, that trail began days before the airplane ever left the ground. On April 14th, 8 days before the crash, the Baron was refueled, but the records were already off. Jeff wrote in his logbook that the tanks held 194 gallons, yet the true amount was only 182. That 12-gallon gap might not sound like much, but on a small airplane it was enough to erase almost an hour of safe flight time. Because the mistake was never corrected, it followed him through every flight until the final one. Flight planning added to the danger. When preparing for the April 22nd trip to Kerrville, Jeff filed an instrument flight plan that showed 58 gallons on board. For an hour-long flight, that number looked acceptable, but the regulations demanded more. An IFR trip required fuel for the destination, a possible alternate airport, and a 45-minute reserve. The total should have been at least 67 gallons, yet Jeff believed he had less and still pressed ahead. In truth, the airplane carried even less than he thought, closer to 50 usable gallons, leaving no margin at all. Weight and balance created another silent problem. The Baron's maximum certified weight was 5,500 pounds, but on that morning the airplane was closer to 5,600. The center of gravity was also slightly aft of its safe range, which meant the airplane would be harder to control at low speeds or with one engine out. Instead of reducing passengers or cargo, Jeff may have tried to save weight by carrying less fuel, a choice that made the shortage even worse. The pre-flight inspection should have been a chance to catch these errors, but here too things were skipped. Witnesses and reports suggest he checked only one wing tank and did not sump the fuel or inspect both oil levels. The airplane systems gave no alarms. They required a pilot's eyes and hands to confirm. By trusting his routine, Jeff missed the warnings that could have saved him. Psychology played a role as well. Pilots know the term get-home-itis, the mindset of pushing to complete a trip because of schedules, clients, or personal pride. Jeff was flying respected business partners, and the flight was short, so the pressure to finish on time may have pushed him past the safety margins he once valued. Each step seemed small: a wrong entry in a log, a lighter pre-flight, a heavy load, a relaxed attitude about reserves. But together they formed a chain that was already tightening around him before he left Houston. The tragedy was not created in the sky, it was set in motion on the ground. The real question now is what happened once the Baron took off and the errors of planning turned into life-or-death problems in the air. The morning flight from Houston began like hundreds of others Jeff Weiss had made before. At 7:30 a.m., the Baron lifted into clear skies, climbing smoothly and settling on a route west toward Kerrville. For nearly an hour, nothing seemed unusual. The engines hummed steadily, and the passengers could have felt calm, perhaps even talking about the business ahead. The weather was not severe, visibility was good, and the airplane moved along without trouble. Yet hidden inside the fuel tanks, the shortage that had been building for days was closing in. As the Baron neared Kerrville, Jeff contacted air traffic control for an approach to runway 12. The controller instructed him to follow a GPS path that included an extended leg through a waypoint called OBUCO, which stretched the flight a little longer than expected. Each extra mile consumed precious gallons, but in the cockpit, there was no warning siren or flashing light to show how close the tanks were to empty. Around 13 miles from the airport, the first sign of trouble appeared. The left engine sputtered and then quit, leaving the airplane with only one source of power. 10 seconds later, the right engine also went silent. In a matter of moments, the twin-engine safety net was gone, and the Baron became a glider carrying 6 lives. Jeff managed to restart the left engine briefly, but the situation was already dangerous. With one engine running and the other dead, the airplane became unstable. The natural instinct in that moment is to push the working engine harder, but at low speed, that creates a pull to one side that is difficult to control. Instead of reducing power to stay balanced, the thrust caused the Baron to roll and yaw, a classic trap for twin-engine pilots. Other mistakes made recovery even harder. The flaps, which had been lowered to 15 degrees, were never retracted, and that created drag that slowed the airplane even more. The propeller on the dead engine was not feathered, so it windmilled against the air like a spinning brake. These details might sound small, but they meant the difference between holding altitude and falling below the minimum speed required to stay in control. Witnesses on the ground later described what they saw with horror. The Baron descended steeply, banking to the right as if it had lost all balance, and within seconds it vanished behind a ridge. A heavy crash echoed across the valley, marking the end before anyone on board had time to understand what was happening. The image of an airplane falling only minutes from its destination shocked not only the families but also the wider aviation community. Pilots around the country asked themselves what they would have done with 2 engines lost and so little time left. The truth is that fuel exhaustion should never have reached this stage, yet the way Jeff responded once the engines failed became another link in the chain of tragedy. So what did investigators find when they searched through the wreckage and studied the data to understand the final minutes of flight? When the crash site was secured, investigators from the National Transportation Safety Board began piecing together what had gone wrong. They collected wreckage, examined the engines, and recovered the digital data from the airplane's engine monitor. The first discovery was clear. There was no evidence of fire or explosion, which often signals a fuel-related accident. Both engines were intact, and mechanical failure was ruled out quickly. Attention then turned to the fuel system. By comparing the logbook entries with fueling records, investigators realized that Jeff Weiss had been working with the wrong numbers for more than a week. On April 14th, he had logged 194 gallons after a refuel, but the actual amount was only 182. The error was never corrected, and across 5 flights, the airplane slowly burned through its reserve without him noticing. The gauges in the cockpit only made the situation worse. Tests showed they were consistently reading about 5 gallons too high on each side. For a pilot already trusting his log, this created a false picture of safety. By the morning of April 22nd, calculations showed that the Baron lifted off with around 38 usable gallons. That was barely enough for the trip, and certainly not enough to meet the legal reserve requirements for instrument flying. Investigators also studied Jeff's emergency actions. The data confirmed that when the engines quit, he did not retract the flaps or feather the right propeller. These choices added drag and reduced his chance of holding speed above the minimum control level. In their final report, the NTSB concluded that the accident was caused by fuel exhaustion due to inaccurate record-keeping and poor pre-flight planning. They also cited inadequate cockpit management once both engines failed. The report included a note on Jeff's health. He suffered from significant coronary artery disease, but toxicology results and flight data showed he remained in control until the impact, so his condition was not a direct factor. The language of the report was firm: poor judgment, insufficient planning, and improper emergency response. It was a sobering conclusion for a pilot who had once been praised for his commitment to safety. The findings left no doubt about the chain of errors, but they also raised a deeper issue. If someone with decades of experience could fall into such a trap, what does that say about the culture of general aviation and the hidden risks that remain for others? The Kerrville crash was shocking, but it was not the first time that fuel problems and missed procedures ended in disaster. History shows that aviation accidents often grow from small mistakes, and famous cases prove how unforgiving those mistakes can be. In 1983, Air Canada Flight 143 became known as the Gimli glider. The Boeing 767 left Montreal for Edmonton, but the pilots confused pounds with kilograms when converting fuel. The airplane took off with less than half the fuel it needed, and midway through the flight, both engines went silent. The huge jet turned into a glider with 69 people on board, and only quick thinking and luck, allowed the captain to land safely on an old airstrip in Gimli, Manitoba. This case showed how a simple math error could nearly destroy an airliner. 7 years later, Avianca Flight 52 from Colombia to New York faced a different chain of mistakes. The aircraft was delayed by heavy traffic at JFK and circled longer than expected. Fuel reserves ran out on approach, yet the crew never used the words "fuel emergency" with controllers. Because the urgency was not clear, clearance was delayed and the engines shut down before landing. 73 people died, and investigators concluded that poor communication and fuel mismanagement combined to cause the tragedy. It was another reminder that clear language and careful planning are critical when lives depend on minutes of endurance. In 2005, Helios Airways Flight 522 in Greece showed yet another weakness in cockpit discipline. This time it was not fuel, but pressurization. The crew failed to reset the cabin system after maintenance, so the airplane slowly lost oxygen.
Helios 522, do you read?
The pilots and passengers lost consciousness, and the aircraft flew on autopilot until it crashed, killing all 121 on board. The disaster underlined the same theme: when checklist steps are skipped, even advanced aircraft cannot save lives. The pattern across these cases is clear. Airplanes are powerful machines, but they cannot protect passengers from human error, whether it is a wrong conversion, a phrase not spoken, or a switch left in the wrong position. The TRAGlC crash fits this same cycle. A false log entry, gauges that read too high, and a skipped inspection combined to place a skilled pilot and trusted passengers into an impossible situation. History shows that aviation only advances when these lessons are remembered. But the haunting question remains: have we learned fast enough, or will more lives be lost before change takes hold? The courtroom settlements that followed the TRAGlC crash awarded the families of the victims nearly $12 million. It was recognition of the loss, but for those who lost husbands, wives, and parents, no legal judgment could fill the silence left behind. Money might replace property, but it could never rebuild the voices, relationships, and projects that disappeared that April morning. In Houston, the community was shaken. The city had lost more than passengers on a private plane. It had lost leaders in real estate, architecture, and the arts. The Kensingers were remembered as devoted to their children's school and to local charity efforts. Mark Tellefson's family name had been tied to construction projects across Texas for generations, and his absence created a gap in both business and tradition. The death of Mark Siano, whose creativity shaped public spaces and whose marriage tied him to the Houston Ballet, rippled through cultural life. These were not faceless names. They were builders, dreamers, and influencers whose loss reminded the city that air travel carries real risks, even in the hands of respected pilots. For pilots across the country, the TRAGlC disaster became a sobering case study. Here was a man with more than 5,600 hours of flight time, an owner of his own airplane, and someone known for putting safety first, yet his routine broke down in the worst way possible. It forced the question: if experience cannot protect against complacency, what can? Some argued for better technology. Fuel systems could be redesigned with more accurate sensors, clearer warnings, and digital cross-checks that leave less room for human error. Others pointed to training, saying that emergency drills must be repeated until pilots respond automatically, even under shock. And many spoke of aviation culture, warning that trust in reputation is not the same as trust in procedure. Safety depends on discipline, not on hours logged or the number of flights completed without incident. The most powerful lesson was also the simplest. 4 gallons of fuel, less than the size of a common gas can, can be the line between a safe landing and a fatal descent. It was a chilling reminder that in aviation, small margins matter, A missing step, a skipped check, or a few pounds of extra weight can erase every advantage of technology and experience. The Kerrville crash joined a long history of accidents that were not about broken airplanes, but about human choices. It highlighted how even one weak link in the chain, whether log entries, faulty gauges, or a rushed inspection, can turn a normal flight into a headline. For families, the grief remains. For aviation, the warning is clear. So the question still echoes: will the industry change enough to prevent the next tragedy, or will history continue to be written in the same painful way? The Kerrville crash shows us that disasters in the air are not always caused by storms or failing engines. Sometimes they come from small mistakes, wrong numbers, or skipped checks that build into a chain no pilot can escape once airborne. It proves that experience alone is not enough, because even a respected pilot with thousands of hours can fall when discipline fades. Safety isn't a milestone to achieve, it's a discipline to practice every single day. But it also leaves a bigger question: how many hidden risks remain in the skies, and will we act fast enough to stop the next tragedy?